Back when I was a kid, my dad took me and my older brother on a long camping trip. It was one of those spontaneous decisions, and it was back in the 80s, and we were staying with him for only a few days. He packed up his truck, and off he went. He drove for what seemed like hours until we got to some woods nearby, and he said he'd stayed with Grandpa and Uncle when he was a kid. We set up the tent and wanted to make a fire as the sun would be setting soon, and we were getting pretty hungry. My brother and I kept talking about how much we wanted hot dogs the whole time. Me and my brother headed into the trees to grab some kindling before it got too dark. We must have gotten further than we had intended. As you know, you've seen one tree, you've seen them all. It's kind of just how the woods are to an unexperienced woodsman. But I was just a kid, so I didn't really know any better. After going in too far, we became a little disorientated. And, being the oldest, Jason, my older brother, was sure he knew the way out. I remember him kind of panicking a little bit, but trying to reassure me that everything was okay, and that he was going to lead us out of this mess. I do remember it being real quiet. All you could hear was the sound of our sneakers crunching on the leaves and twigs underfoot. It was unnaturally quiet, kind of unnerving to say the least. And all of a sudden, Jason, my older brother, stopped very abruptly. I dang near bumped straight into him, and I even told him, in the classic style, "What's the big idea?" He ordered me to be quiet, peering around him. I wondered what he'd seen. His eyes seemed fixated on something that was just beyond my vision, something that I could not see. What was it? Possibly a bear? I know they're around here, and even at that young age, I knew running into one would be bad news. Now, most of the time, bears will usually run away, but if you encounter a mama bear with her cubs nearby, you better run for the hills, or try and climb a tree. But then again, bears climb trees. Could it have been a coyote, or maybe a wolf? But I didn't think we had bears, coyotes, or wolves out where we were. Then, I saw it. I'm not afraid to tell you that I peed my pants as I clung on to my older brother Jason for dear life. I was pretty sure that we were as good as dead. What we saw, standing on two legs, not even 10 feet away from us, was what I can only describe as a Wolfman or Dogman. It had the head of a Doberman pinscher and a very sleek, muscular body, very toned, very, very short hair, enough that we could see each individual rippling muscle underneath its fur. It must have been well over 7 feet tall, because my dad at the time was a tall guy, probably 6'4", 6'5", and this thing stood taller than him. It was also much wider than him. It was like a really muscular man. And again, the head was unmistakably that of a Doberman pinscher, but very large, almost too large, like it wasn't proportioned with its body. And all I remember seeing were white teeth and yellow glowing eyes. It bared its teeth at us and howled, but it wasn't like a howl in a traditional sense like a wolf does. This was like an ungodly, unholy howl, like a distorted human yell mixed with that of a painful cry of a dog. It was awful. "Run," Jason had yelled at me, and we hot-tooted out of there quicker than we ever have before. We knew as we got older, you're not supposed to ever run from a predator. But at this age, and being caught up in total fear, we had no other option. This thing surprisingly didn't give chase to us, and somehow luck was on our side. We came tearing out and straight into my dad's arms. When we had told him what he'd seen, he just made us get into the tent, and we went back into the woods with a flashlight and a shotgun a little later. I felt much safer with my father, even if this creature was out there. Of course, we didn't see anything, not with him, and he never saw anything out of the ordinary. But you can imagine, because of that event, we didn't get an ounce of sleep that night, and we left the first thing the following morning. My brother and I kept talking to him about it, even the following morning, and I can recall my father getting kind of annoyed with us because he thought we had just saw a mistaken identity of a bear, or possibly a wolf, and totally blew it out of proportion. It doesn't help that kids have a natural tendency to do that anyway, so that's why I believe that he did not believe our story. I got to be a part of a hiking expedition that occurred out in the Rockies, and, in a very swift moment, I had been turned around and separated from the other hikers. This is a hiker's worst nightmare, and I was very inexperienced at the time. I found myself in a landscape that was incongruous with what I knew about the Rocky Mountains. The ground turned coarse and full of rubble. Plants seemed practically non-existent, and a thick mist was rising, cutting me off from getting my bearings. Worse yet, I couldn't hear the group at all. Several times I tried screaming at the top of my lungs, just to see if I could get anybody to answer me. There was nothing. Nothing but the faintest sound around me. In fact, sometimes it seems like nature itself was silent, shushing me as to stay silent with it. The first sign that things were not right was the article of clothing I found. I came across a pink denim cap of one of the people that had been hiking in my group. I didn't remember the girl's name, but I distinctly remember that faded pink cap for some reason. I am one of those people that can remember far more details than I can a person's name, but that's just how it is. I picked that up with the intention of eventually returning it to her. I dared to take the side of the hat as a sign of hope. Perhaps I was near them after all. But how could she have dropped the hat and not realized? It really didn't make sense. The hope was short-lived when I came across a backpack that had also belonged to someone in my group, but I couldn't place who it was. It wasn't the girl. I continued through the thickening fog with the distinct feeling that I was just going in circles. My rations and supplies were very limited. If this continued, I would have no choice but to perish out here all alone. I came across another possession of one of my truckmates. This time, there was a new level of bad news. It was a bandana that I remember seeing on one of the guys with spiked hair. It was stained with something dark and red, and I knew what it was. I just didn't want to admit it. I couldn't fathom my brain going there. It was at that point that I began to feel panic stalking me from a distance. My first thought was that robbers had came upon my group. Or maybe not robbers, but modern-day bandits. I don't know. Something had clearly happened to them. I hadn't heard any noises that would suggest a big bear or a big cat attack. No screaming, no crying, nothing. I even looked in the dirt. There didn't seem to be any signs of a struggle. It's as if their clothing had just fallen. So, I quickened my pace, with visibility reducing by the minute. And the things I could see were things that I didn't want to. I came across a pair of shattered glasses that were all too similar to be the pair worn by the Asian girl in my group. Then, there was a torn sports bra that was also bloodstained. One article after another, I could recognize as being from my group, emerged out of the fog as I pressed onward, and my own sanity was beginning to teeter. So, I broke into a light jog. Even though the ground and the visibility was treacherous, the path began to lower with the unusual rocky ground rising on either side of me. And then, just like that, the trail went into a small cave, small enough that if I wanted to get inside, I would have had to stoop down. Something inside me wanted to turn and run, but my conscious curiosity overrode my primal caution. So, I struck up my lighter and reached into the cave. What came next, I remember only in particles, because, in my mind, evidently, was closer to breaking than I'd realized at the time. The halo of the flame showed nothing but rock at first, but then a pair of eyes had turned to me from somewhere at the edge of the light's influence, and then another, and more. Then, the light showed me towering furry bodies that were hunched at the back, as if they were all used to a life of crouching and hiding. I hate to tell you this part, because it's going to sound like I'm crazy, but I can only tell you exactly what they resembled. And what they resembled were werewolves. That's the worst word to use with the complete overexposure that this has gotten. But honestly, there's no other word to describe what animal I saw. Their teeth extended well past their lips, and I can tell you they had long ears that looked like horns almost. Their mouths were busy chewing and gnashing something. I could hear the sounds of ripping and tearing. It was meat. They were eating on something. I didn't see. I immediately worked my way out, and they didn't give chase, and I'll never know why. Maybe there's a reason they didn't get to me. I'll never know. After climbing my way out, luckily, I eventually found a trail, even though I was completely and utterly traumatized. I ended up contacting authorities, and they did a very thorough investigation and did a search of the area, but only uncovered nothing, which isn't surprising. I told them all about the bloody clothes and all the belongings they left behind, that we were attacked by large unknown predators. They didn't really seem to take my story seriously, and in fact, I was even a suspect in a potential murder since they disappeared. But nothing they found was conclusive. I even told them there was a cave where these beasts lived in. I understand this story is sounding more and more crazy as I go on, but this is my experience that I have to live with forever, for the rest of my life. I don't get to just shut it off. And then, of course, after all of that, I had the trauma of dealing with being a potential suspect of their disappearance, which didn't result in anything, because like I said, they couldn't find anything conclusive that led to me resulting in that. Anyway, they're all gone now. This was almost 9 years ago, and I still live with the pain, and I've only told a handful of people, in hopes that somebody can give me reassurance that things will be okay, and that I'll be able to get through everything. I have been ordered not to share this story, since it involves law enforcement, and also because nobody would ever believe it. So, I know I'm butchering my credibility by not telling you where I'm from or where this took place, but that's okay. I feel like the exposure of this story is more important than anything else, so I'm okay with keeping things anonymous. I was off duty and driving through a residential neighborhood, because why not? Things happen in broad daylight in places that could easily be next door. So, I made a pass through your average suburbia. There was only 3-story houses that seemed to have a cul-de-sac all to itself, and no sooner had I turned past it, I heard gunshots and screaming. I mentally patted myself on the back for I decided to turn through here, and I got out and charged the door with my service pistol drawn. I crashed through the front door and yelled out that the police were on the premises. The house had no answer. This bothered me. Things don't just go from 0 to 100 and then right back to 0. I did a full sweep of the lower level of the house, all the while calling out warning signs to any perpetrators. The ground level was empty. I went up the first flight of stairs I could find, and there was a swath of blood all along the white carpet that led from one room to another. I picked a direction and followed. My choice brought me to where things had started. A bedroom where there were apparent bullet holes in the wall, with blood splattering, so somebody had landed their rounds, and a bed that was not only bathed in blood, but shredded up in ways that shouldn't have been possible. I sized it up as somebody that had fired shots in self-defense, but their attacker wasn't stopped, and they must have had a machete or something. because the level of violence displayed on this bed was ridiculous. This wasn't just a war. This was a massacre. Something heinous happened. So, I continued to follow the trail of blood in the opposite way. It led to a very strange oddity, a closed-off stairwell that went to the basement down below. I wouldn't have found it on the ground floor. It was accessible only from the basement and from the second story. I had never heard of a house having this, or ever seen any sort of construction like this before. But I digress. The trail of blood went down the carpeted steps, down into the basement, where the lights were off. Okay, this was beginning to feel like I was in some sort of sci-fi movie or horror show. So, I gripped my gun tightly and slowly made my descent. I steeled myself and proceeded, changing my tactics to being quiet. Anybody that makes big of a mess had to have been a serial killer, so I shouldn't take my chances. Of course, what are the chances that this would all happen when I was off duty, and I just got to be a part of it? The basement looked to be mostly a man cave, and down there, I saw signs of another struggle when I flicked on the lights. Well, they didn't stay on very long. I heard a flick from somewhere else, and they went off. I tried the same light switch, and the lights came back on, and again, they went off. I yelled that I knew they were down there, and they needed to stop playing games. What happened next was so fast that to this day, I still doubt my own memory. It was too bizarre, too strange. I flicked the lights on for the third time, and charged my way through the basement, as silently as possible, keeping my weapon ready and drawn. I wanted to catch where the sound of the other switch was coming from, and I found it. I honed in on it. I produced my tactical light and told whoever was in the cone of light to freeze. Clutching a bloodied and mutilated body was simply a monster, straight out of the nightmares of any person. It was a wolf, with long legs and long arms, and blood-matted fur all around its face. But this wasn't just a wolf. It was standing upright, like that of a man. It even had the body and legs of a man, and the chest and arms and shoulders. This was basically a bodybuilder, covered in thick matted fur, with the extremely large head of a wolf. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. This was like out of a horror movie. It stood so tall that the ceiling forced it to hunch over. I emptied my entire magazine into it. It dropped the body and almost danced around the room, swatting at the bullets like they were flies, even though I know I hit this thing. Somehow, I lost sight of it in the darkness, and it escaped the cone of light from my tactical light. I had no idea where it had gone, and it was gone. I did a double check of the room. Every nook and cranny was scoured through and covered, but I never saw any trace of it or where it could have gone. I even checked back upstairs, even though it would have been impossible to get up there without me knowing. I never found it. I had the coroner show up, and they took the bodies away. The thing had killed 4 people inside the house and was taking them down to the basement. I waited for the story to drop, but it never did. When I asked about it, I was told that I would keep my mouth shut if I wanted to keep my job and not be persecuted, among other heinous things. I'm sorry, but I have to tell somebody. The case was kept very, very quiet, and in fact, even the family was told by other family members that these people died under mysterious circumstances, not even so much as an animal attack. It was unusual. I believe the higher-ups knew something that I didn't, because when I tried to explain to them what I saw, I was quickly dismissed and threatened with lots of horrible things. That's my story. A few years ago now, I was driving home through a really thick wooded backcountry road to the old farmhouse that my parents had lived in forever. It was fall time, but not too late in the evening. The sun was still in the sky. although getting close to setting. If you think about it, around September, October, I want to say the sun sets somewhere around 7 to 8 o'clock at night. I can't be exactly sure, so it was probably sometime around there. I had my earbuds in, my AirPods actually, so I couldn't hear much, but it wasn't like it was on the highway. Chances were, I wouldn't encounter another vehicle until I pulled up at the house. That's just how remote and isolated my parents were, and they preferred it that way. They enjoyed the absolute solitude and silence of not having any neighbors nearby. I mean, in this day and age, I can't really blame them. I did, however, have my wits about me and my eyes on the road. No distractions. However, as A, I'm not a moron, and B, a buddy of mine had wiped out and hit a buck a few months back, completely totaled his car. I think he was doing 60 or 70, and of course, I think it was a 4 or 5 pointer walked right out in front of his car, and he wasn't driving anything too impressive. I think it was a Toyota Camry, so you can imagine the carnage that happened. Luckily, by the blessing of whatever higher power you believe in, he managed to only have a couple fractures here and there, but nothing too big. But I really didn't want to be dealing with that, especially the fallout of not having a vehicle to work with. So, whilst singing along to Taylor Swift, I was able to throw my foot down hard on the brake as soon as I saw what I thought was a large deer run out in front of me. My Aunt Susie used to be obsessed with a TV show called The X-Files. I've watched a few reruns with her, and it's been on cable TV. If you're anybody, I'm sure you've heard of it. But if you haven't, well, simply Google it. This thing that stood in front of my car, my first thought was, thanks to Mulder, it's a werewolf. Thankfully, I had a good sense to remember that they only come out at night and on a full moon. I'll have you know, I did my lore research, since it didn't seem to want to do anything with me, or to me. It was just staring off, as if trying to decide whether to run or not. I managed to get a good look at it before I hit the gas pedal and sped off. This thing was huge, taller than any man I know for sure. It was all covered in hair or fur, but like a Bigfoot, I guess. I mean, I guess it could have been a Bigfoot, right? Except it had a dog head. It wasn't the face, it was the fact that it looked like a wolf with only parts of a human face. It could have been some sort of wild man with a snout, but it had ears, definitive wolf-like ears that were tall and pointed, with hair, bits of hair at the very tip. I don't know what it was. I guess if I had to draw from somewhere, I would say the closest it resembled was a human-like German Shepherd. We got a German Shepherd working out on my parents' farm. So, imagine a German Shepherd's face. Make it completely black, and the upper part of its face where there's no snout, make it more human-like. That's what this thing looked like. Again, I've thought many times this might have been a Bigfoot, but I don't know anything about Bigfoot, and I don't know if Bigfoots have snouts or what they look like. This just thing had a face that was wrong. Suddenly, there was a faint growl once it ran off. It sounded like it was coming from behind. After I sped off, my heart was pounding, my mind racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. Whatever this thing was, I was sure and certain that this didn't normally exist, whatever it was. But fortunately, it didn't seem to want to hurt me. I kind of got the impression by the whole encounter that this thing was caught off guard by my car almost running into it, and it seemed like it had to make a quick decision to bolt across the road to get out of there. When I got home, I told them that I had seen a Wolfman or a Bigfoot out in the back countryside, and, of course, they told me that they've seen things like that for decades. And although it's something they don't like to talk about, there have been sightings of it around here. It was terrifying, and my heart was racing, and so was my mind. But from what my parents told me, there had never been any attacks, not even on livestock. I still drive down that road every single day, but I've yet to see anything like it again. And even when driving late at night, even through the winter and summertime, nothing. I feel kind of silly, even writing this or saying it out loud. Mainly because none of my family or friends have ever believed my story. So, I'm writing this to you and confiding to you, in hopes that somebody can hear my story out. So, here it goes. I feel like you might be the type of person who will know if it's the truth, and I hope so. I love all animals, and I have a house full of cats and dogs. I have fish, I even have mice. They're all kept very safely, and all mind their own business. I like to think of myself as a very responsible pet owner. Outside, I have chickens. Neither my dogs nor my cats are remotely bothered by these chickens, aside from being a tad noisy now and then, especially if one of the cats is taking a nap. But they never try to get into the chicken run. I don't know if I'm just blessed with well-behaved animals or what, but as odd as it is, and strange as it is, my cats and dogs happen to get along. So, when I woke up one morning and found 2 of my 6 chickens dead, I was pretty upset. They hadn't just been frightened or killed quickly. These chickens, well, there really wasn't much left of them. It was piles of gore. Of course, everybody was quick to assume that it must have just been a coyote or a fox. But I've never seen foxes or coyotes kill chickens like this, not being ripped to shreds and just left a pile of guts. That usually doesn't happen in any natural predator. So, I buried what was left and fixed a far more secure wire fencing all around the run. Next morning, the same thing. 2 more of my remaining 6 were found, mutilated, ripped to pieces. It's almost like something picked them up and just ripped them in half and then smashed those into pieces and ripped those up into more. That's what it looked like. Like something had taken a chicken and shredded it into ribbons. In fact, I couldn't even really discern any specific part of the chicken, like the head, neck, face, nothing. It was just piles of feathers and gore. I was beginning to get really upset, but also couldn't possibly see how a fox or a coyote could have gotten into it with a wire grid on top. It would have to lift it off. So, that following night, I kept watch from the kitchen window, in darkness, so, just to make sure I wasn't seen by whatever animal was hurting my girls. The security light was positioned right over the pen. To be perfectly honest with you, I'm not entirely sure what I thought I was going to see. I maybe assumed it was maybe a group of coyotes who had found their way to dig under and get these chickens, or maybe just an abnormally sized fox. Either way, I wasn't really equipped with any weapons, so if I saw anything appear, my best guess is I would try and scare it away, turn on the lights, and shout. Whatever was going through my mind, I just sat there and drank tea, watching out the window. I was in no way prepared for what I saw, nor could I have ever imagined something like this exists in our realm of reality. I can remember that it was exactly 10:32 p.m. That's important, because I was consistently and constantly checking the clock, just so I could see exactly what time this thing was appearing. Although it was already dark outside and quiet, it was by no means sleepy yet. This was not a dream. I was hopped up on tons of caffeine, after probably having my second big glass of tea. I heard my last 2 remaining chickens start to squawk. Then, all of a sudden, it became deathly silent. I remember thinking I got it, ready to bang on the window and scare away this stupid fox, or what I thought was a bushy-tailed vermin. Only, what I saw that night was nothing at all resembling a fox. This thing was humongous, far taller than I, and stood upright, just like a person. 2 legs. At first, I even assumed it was a person. The legs were just like that of a man. Knees, calves, thighs, everything. At first, I'm not exactly sure what I was looking at. It was covered in hair, and not like a fox. This was black as night. I'm not talking smoky or charcoal. I'm talking black. And its face, I'll never forget it. As I've said, I love animals, and I have had a variety of dogs over the years, including Alaskan Malamutes, all sorts of dogs. In fact, one of my dogs was an ex-police dog. Beautiful, but vicious towards strangers. That was what I saw hovering over the chicken coop now. A bipedal, humongous Dogman, with a very distinct face of what I would call a German Shepherd or a wolf, except it was black. Its ears didn't look right though. Usually, a wolf or German Shepherd have more perkier, wider ears. This had very tall, pointed ears that were very slender. It was creepy looking, and it looked wrong. What am I saying? The entire thing, all of it, looked off, like it wasn't normal. This thing grabbed the chicken and literally ripped it in two, just like somebody grabbing a crumpled up piece of paper and ripping it in half. The amount of gore that shot out was disturbing and made me drop my glass. I'm not afraid to say that I didn't bang on the window or shout. I was frozen in terror, watching this thing just mutilate and annihilate my poor chickens. It wasn't even putting the chickens up to its mouth or eating them, just killing them. It seemed like it was taking pleasure in ripping them to shreds. I told everybody who would listen in the morning, but everybody called me crazy, and they told me those kinds of things don't exist, and I must have been dreaming, due to the stress of losing chickens. In fact, they even all agreed that I had fallen asleep, and at that time, the fox had gotten in again. They never found it necessary to explain, however, how a fox or a coyote could get in my hen and do the damage like this. In fact, I couldn't even explain it. Nor could I explain what I saw that night, nor do I know what it could be. So, I'm sending this to you, in hopes of maybe some answers. Do you have any idea what I saw, and what was killing my chickens? But more importantly, if this is some sort of animal or predator, why didn't it eat them? Why was it taking pleasure in just killing them and leaving them? I have never heard of an animal doing such a thing. Back when I was a very young man, I got a summer job working out in the cornfields. It was very hard work, but honest work pays well, when it was decent enough to help me save up for a new car of my own. See, I had been bumming rides for my friend, and even my parents, offering what little money I had for gas, just trying to get around, and I got sick of it. I'd been used to helping my dad do mechanic work out in the garage when I was younger, and because I would usually try and devote as much time as I could to help him, he would pay me for it, extra what I was already making in my allowance, which helped. And that lasted until I was around 14 or 15, when I just kind of lost interest. And at the time being, I was giving as much money as I can in gas, but that's besides the point. As I stared up at the ball of fire in the sky each day, that was my focus. A new car, my own set of wheels. I didn't have to go super expensive, but I wasn't going to do a $600 beater. Unless you grew up in the Midwest like me, you've really got no real idea just how big those cornfields are, and how darn tall some of that stuff can get. When the job had started, there were only a few of us out there each day, and although the hours were very long, the fields were vast. We'd meet up for lunch breaks just to hear another voice or two. But as the weeks progressed on, the work dwindled, and soon, I was the only sucker left out there. I'm telling you, nothing makes you feel more isolated than being in a cornfield, what feels all by yourself. I took to telling myself stories just to get through those long days of total solitude. But What I saw that very last afternoon sure as hell wasn't no fake ghost story, and I swear this on my mama's grave. There were all sorts of critters trying to get to that corn. I'd seen woodchucks, deer, raccoons, but never in my wildest dreams had I seen the likes of this thing before. In fact, something like this I thought only existed in the movies. But I guess I was wrong. Maybe these are just wild animals that live in certain regions of the country. I don't know. It was coming up towards the end of the day, and it had been very hot, especially if you know anything about the state of Indiana. The first thing I recall was that it seemed to have gotten really quiet all of a sudden. It's like somebody took the master volume of everything around me, nature included, and pulled it way down to zero. All I could hear was the corn swaying in the wind, but barely that. No bugs, no birds, no twittering, nothing. Zip. I remember standing there for a moment, wondering what on earth could make everything go quiet. The silence was deafening, so much so that it caught my attention and made me stop. I didn't feel right. Something just felt off. A couple of times I seen an eagle fly over, and man, those creatures made a lot of noise trying to scare them off and warn each other. But I ain't never heard silence before like this. Walking a bit further into the highest corn, I saw why. This thing was standing with its back to me at first. I didn't know what it was, but my mind told me I needed to get out of there, and now. Only my legs wouldn't obey. It's like I was being pulled towards this thing, whatever it was, whoever he was. Real slow, he turned around, or it turned around, and I got a very good look at it. Now, here's my story. I know you're probably not going to believe me, because it probably seems so make-believe, but it's the God-honest truth. What I saw was real tall, like 8 feet or so, covered in dark black hair, matted all over its body. Its legs were like that of a dog, and that's what it resembled. It even had the hocks, but its feet were like massive paws spread out. This thing had really long, stretched, lengthy arms, like a human, but more dangly like a chimpanzee. How its arms go far past its waist. But worst of all, the head was like a wolf, a real mean-looking wolf, staring down at me like I had just disturbed it and it wasn't happy to see me. The most intense and fiercest looking eyes. This thing opened its mouth, and oh God, the teeth. They were more like giant fangs with sharp little bladed teeth throughout its mouth. I don't know if this is a wolf or what, but as far as I knew, wolves didn't have teeth like this. It was like every tooth was serrated and razor sharp. I didn't hang around no more to find out just what he intended to do with that mouth. I turned and I ran all the way back to my father's truck, and I never stepped foot in those fields ever again after that. Even though it was my last day, I had to tell my boss that I had a medical emergency, and I just never called him back. Yeah, I know no-shows are no good, but I can't tell you what that was like. Again, I never stepped foot into those fields ever again. Screw the car and screw the money. It wasn't worth it. My parents died when I was very young. I had gotten into a car accident, and now I'm 25 and living just outside of LA. Yes, even with all the crazy riots and burning going on, somehow I'm still here. Before all the COVID and the civil unrest craziness, I was an aspiring actress and model. But since everything's gone down, I've kind of decided to possibly change my career. My grandmother looked after me on her farm in Baltimore as a kid, and it was very fulfilling. My grandmother was a woman of the land. She devoured books and read like nobody else I knew, and could tell a story that would rivet any audience. As her only grandchild, I grew up being told of strange creatures, near and far. Some that flew in the sky, some that stalked through the woods, and some that even lived under my bed. These creatures seemed real to me, not at all scary, but more mysterious. I can still hear my grandmother's rattly voice telling me of the man that looked like a dog that she spotted late at night, through her bin. That was one of her stories that made me laugh. I figured it was just a local drunk that hadn't shaven in a few days, or a homeless guy, since she read so many stories about monsters to me. You know, like the ones in the closet, or the ones that will come out of the woods and grab you if you don't eat your vegetables. I had no really discernment of knowing that this was something true that she saw. I had also read in the Guinness Book of World Records that some people had so much facial hair that it grew minutes after shaving it. So I figured this Dogman that my grandmother spoke of was a guy like this. But something about this was different. I remember her whispering to me, "No, no," her gravelly voice shaking with trepidation, explaining to me that this was a sighting far more terrible than the rest, and was real. My grandmother's father and mother came over from London, England, and so she had a hint of an English accent. She didn't present herself like most country women. Her gray hair was tied up in an elegant bun, and she wore makeup even, despite her face being lined with wrinkles from hard work in the sun. Then, one night, when I was around 10 years old, long after the car accident, my grandmother had tucked me in bed, and I looked out at our small farm, stretches of land. By the way, at this point in the story, I was already living with my grandmother full time, since my parents had already passed away, and I was in the process of grieving and dealing with all of this. Anyway, it seemed the loneliest place for any creature, I thought. Sleep was coming for me, and I felt that floaty feeling in your head, as it's filled with nothingness, images churning rhythmically, and then you enter dreamland. I awoke with a sudden jerk, and I remember hearing something guttural, something groaning just outside my window. But the problem was, my bedroom was on the second floor, and overlooked our prized chestnut tree, which was now orange and amber, with Baltimore October bringing a beautiful autumn. I jumped out of my bed and looked out to see what it was. Perhaps one of the cattle had escaped, but that had never happened before, not that I know of, and never could imagine making a sound like this. This was almost a growl, like a gnawing sound, very animalistic, and I never heard it before. Pressing my ear to the window, I could hear the same rasping sound. I turned my head to the side and looked directly at our tree. I witnessed one of the most horrendous, disturbing visions any child could ever see. My favorite pony at the time, which, by the way, my grandmother had several, her name was Jasmine, was dead, laid horizontally, her white coat ripped open and covered with blood, and her innards spewing all throughout the lawn. It was awful. I was in shock and started crying. Above her, though, was something far more terrifying. I didn't make it out right away, but as I looked closer, I could see a large dark shape that was leaning over her body. Whatever had killed her was right there. Then, this shape looked up at me and stood up on two legs all at the same time. Large yellow, glowing eyes, fur as black as the night, and very, very large and muscular. It was like a ripped six-pack, all throughout its muscles. It was so buff, and it had large black claws, each at least 6 inches long, if I'm not mistaken. This was what I can only describe to you as a werewolf or a wolfman. Its face, however, was not that of a dog, though. And when I say wolf, I mean it looked like a really fierce evil wolf, with giant fangs that hung outside of its mouth. It even had blood dripping down from its chin. Whatever this thing was had not only killed Jasmine, but was eating on her still. Although I wanted to turn my face away, I kept on staring, transfixed in total fear and terror. My heart was sinking into my stomach, and sickness was rising to my throat. I was hoping this was a nightmare, that this horror before my bedroom window was fiction. I felt like vomiting. I was looking right into hell, my very own gallery of horror, and me on the front row. After this thing turned to face me, it crouched back down and turned its attention back towards its meal. I shuddered and nearly fainted, falling backwards. My grandmother was behind me, her mouth in open horror and concern. She convinced me that this was the devil. We went to bed, crying in each other's arms and praying for morning to come. My grandfather had passed away long ago, so it's not like my grandmother could have charged out there barreling with a gun in its face, nor was she that type of woman. We both hid in her bedroom, locked, and cried all night. In the morning, the only really thing left of Jasmine wasn't very pretty. We gave her a dignified burial. Her carcass was now mostly consumed. This story has had me inside for a long time, and the experience happened many years ago, even after receiving much therapy. In fact, most therapists think the beast serves as a metaphor for my fears. Some unresolved trauma welled deep within my soul. It really caused me a lot of issues. During my high school years, like I just told you, I stayed inside most of the time. In fact, I missed a lot of social outings and opportunities to go hang out with friends a lot. But I know well different that this thing, this creature was real. Its memory is still very vivid in my mind. I have been on efforts to lock it away, in the deepest points of my memory, but it still emerges to haunt me, in my dreams and during my day. My grandmother died a while after the incident, and I continued to stay at a boarding school. I have never been back on the farm since I was a kid, and sometimes I still have the urge to go and see the plot where we bury Jasmine. I just hope that this experience can serve as a reminder to you, or to anybody else you choose to read this to never be too careful about being in the wild, although there are some things that are just pure evil, and I believe this was one of them. Hi. Before I really get into any story, I'll give you a little bit of backstory and info on me. I'm a 33-year-old software developer. I moved here to Mississippi to help with a software company, but originally, I'm from California. I pride myself in being a good Christian man, and I love the Lord. He has blessed me with a beautiful wife and 3 boys. They're all my pride and joy. And because of this, I firmly believe in hard work, in good traditional living, doing good works, being a good person. But this COVID pandemic is absolute baloney, if you ask me. When you die, you die. No questions asked. And if it's not your time, well, it's not your time. In violation of the quarantine rules, I decided to take my sons out shooting with my brother and his 2 boys. All these boys are aged between 9 and 14, so you can imagine it was quite boisterous and lots of energy. It was a good day out, until something happened. I believe there's evil in this world, and what we encountered that day was something not of this world. This was sinister, diabolical, completely from the pits of hell. Something that even my prayers wouldn't keep us from, which for me is saying a lot. Let me get into the story. So, we were walking through the woods. I had my rifle in hand. The kids were running around, playing tag, and myself and my brother were telling them to be quiet, listening to all the sounds, to observe. They eventually did settle down, but were still goofing around. I kept rolling my eyes, hoping they would learn something from 2 older guys. My boots were crunching against the forest floor. I raised my rifle, for any hint of movement or possibly a boar that we could shoot. As the day progressed, one of my boys spotted a deer in the distance, a beautiful white-tailed deer that seemed to dance before us. It hopped and skipped a little in a maze of trees, and we pursued it. Not to kill it. We didn't have any tags for it, but we just wanted to see where it would go. Then we stopped, suddenly and abruptly. This deer that we were chasing was lying dead on the ground, about 25 feet away from us. I was going to use this opportunity to teach my son or my boys about tracks, but this deer was already dead. Its abdomen tore open, and its innards pouring out, giving blood all around it. It looked like a mess that you'd see in a horror movie. My youngest son screamed and hid behind my leg, just like a frightened little child. Normally, I would have called him out for being so scared, but I felt like screaming. Feasting on this deer was a large creature that resembled a wolf, easily the size of a bear. In fact, I even thought it was a bear at first, until it stood up, and towering over me. And I'm 6'2". This thing was double my width, full rippling muscles, kind of like a gorilla, only bigger, vaster in all proportions. Its hands even reminded me, and body even reminded me of a gorilla. But the head was all wrong. It had a head like a dog. I can't really describe to you what it looked like, but maybe a jackal, if I had to guess. But it was black, thick, dark fur. I tried to erase the memory from my head, but the face of this thing was so fierce, so evil. This wasn't normal. There are no normal animals in the woods that stand up on two legs that look anything like this. It had two protruding canines out of its sunken mouth. After maybe not even a moment, this thing turned to look at us, as if giving us a signal with its facial expression to not come any closer, to leave it alone, that it's eating. It had a very annoyed expression on its face, and just looked at us in an intense glare. My kids crying, and me and my brother terrified. We slowly backed away, as much as we could, till it was completely out of view, where we very quickly made our way back to our car, hung up all of our equipment, and drove home silently, almost feeling traumatized, broken, violated. My boys didn't need to see that. They had no idea what they even saw, and I was bombarded with question after question, worried that this thing would come back home to where we were, and our safety, and get them. Or worse, follow us. I had to assure them that this was something else. This was not going to come back and get us. But since then, my son has lost all interest in things, and now spends his time drawing, crying a lot. I believe they have some serious trauma issues from this. And trust me, with COVID, it's been really tough to even get therapy. I too have bouts of anxiety and panic attacks for the first time in my life. It's the not knowing what we saw that is the most troublesome. I almost wonder if I will ever feel okay. I know 2020 has been a tough year, but this experience alone has been far worse than any virus. I still see this creature, its face, ripping open that deer. It makes me break down sometimes. I haven't really explained this to my wife, because what do I even tell her? I don't even know what's wrong with me. I feel like this experience has changed me, like I'm marked, whatever that means. If you have encountered this creature yourself, I would love to hear and share my experiences with you. I was driving home on an isolated road through thick mountain country. It was late and dark, and I honestly couldn't have told you where I was. All I knew was that I needed to stay on the road I was on until I finally left the state and hit home territory. I was bobbing in and out of consciousness. You know how it is when you're exhausted, but trying to push on. I had tried, and I didn't want to admit it. I'd even chugged a Rockstar not too long before this, but my body was so exhausted that even the caffeine and the extra boost of that wasn't giving me what I needed. I was too cheap to spend the money to lay up in a hotel. It became really hard when the rain began to fall, since that sound could put anybody to sleep. I was notorious for using white noise to help me sleep anyway, so that was just the nail in the coffin for me. However, when I was coming up on a bridge, this is where my story happened. My headlights lit up something that looked just like a person, except almost double, if not triple in size. I had to swerve to avoid it, and I sure as hell woke up from that. I wasn't sure if I clipped him or her or it, but my car went sliding and went straight into a ditch. The first thing I did was get out to make sure that I hadn't just hit somebody. Why would there be somebody out here in the middle of nowhere that's wearing all black? There was no one around. I was pretty sure that there had been somebody in the road. I was certain of it, and I was more than a little mad at them for not making sure I was okay. I swear, it felt like the rain had just begun, but my car was good and stuck, and the tires wouldn't grip the mud that were suddenly all on the ground. I didn't want to call for a tow truck, but it was looking like my only option. I sat in my car in the sound of the downpour and tried phoning out when I was sure I had seen movement that was more than just the rain. I was hoping it was help, but looking around, it didn't show me anything to speak of. I shook my head, wondering if it would be a good idea just to sleep right here in the ditch and wait for the tow truck. It might be a little weird, but after all, maybe a good 45-minute nap is what I needed. My thoughts were shaken from my head when the driver's side window was suddenly blocked by the drenched, furry body of something very tall and ugly. It was walking on two legs, but there was no way that this was human. This was a beast of the woods, the closest I've ever come to thinking of some animal as demonic. I never used that description, but this was so ugly and evil looking. It's the only word that I feel would be appropriate. It was pointing its snout right at me and baring its teeth in a menacing grin, like it was smiling at me, like it was happy that I was trapped in this little metal container called a car. I briefly pictured those long yellow fangs sinking into my flesh. In fact, the worst part was its eyes. There was no soul in them, but they were alive with a cold light. I'm not exaggerating. They almost had a faint glow to them. It was supernatural in a sense. The dimness of the weather made that very clear. It ran its claw on my window, which made a squealing sound, and that's about the point that I lost complete bladder control. It was so sadistic, so evil. It drug its claws slowly over my window, all while maintaining stare and a grin, like it was letting me know, "Ha ha, you're stuck in there. There's no way you can run, nowhere you can hide. You're all mine, but I'm gonna make you terrified before I kill you." That's the impression I got from this thing. Those claws were way too long for any practical purpose other than killing. I quickly jammed the lock button on my door, just in case it was smart enough to use the door handle. We continued a horrible stare down for what felt like ever. Another wolf thing came out from the downpour, and then another one. I think in total, I spied 4 separate ones altogether. This was at the time when old man phones were the current phones, and I flipped my phone open. Needless to say, I tried to get pictures, but they were crap. They looked like I had taken pictures of a movie playing on my TV. All at once, these things disappeared, and I found out why. A farmer-looking type pulled up on the road and volunteered to pull me out of the ditch. After the job was done, I thanked him profusely and told him that I had almost become lunch for animals that I had never seen before. I explained to him, assuming he had saw them, that they were upright wolves that looked like they were from hell. He got a look in his face, and after that, I tried to ask him questions, but he seemed very dismissive. I've held on to these memories all these years, but again, they're just memories. Even when I've tried to talk to a therapist about it, they don't even believe me. It's just one of the stories that you can't hold in. I saw something, and more of them. This was a pack of animals. I felt like I was in a werewolf movie, since they all looked very identical. Whatever this big one was, which was the biggest of all of them, by the way, was only mere inches away from my face, separated by a very thin sheet of glass. The only reason I'm alive, I believe, is because of my car window. But then again, this thing was so menacing, so large, and so powerful. I feel like it was just toying with me, because if it really wanted to kill me, I don't see any reason why it couldn't have ripped my door open and pulled me out and killed me. You can't just carry something like this around for the rest of my life and not share it. I'm sharing this with you in hopes you can help me get this out there, to help quench the fear of anybody else who feels invalidated by their own experiences and encounters, or in fear of being mocked. I'm hoping that if you do read this, your audience can decide if I'm full of it or not. Regardless of that, I have the trauma, and I will forever live with this story.